Jay Roussel with the Fort Bend Archaeological Society. We are continuing our pandemic series. Today we're going to talk about some of the oldest tools in Texas with Sergio Ayala. He is very well known for his connection to the Gault site and his work at UT. Sergio, tell us a little bit about what you've been doing over there.
Well, first, thank you for having me. What I've been doing here at Gault over the years is essentially putting my energy and focus into developing more behaviorally oriented analysis in the immense amount of lithics that we have coming from the Gault site. But on top of that, of course, that means I can spread my wings with kind of the skills that I've developed under Dr. Collins and Bruce Bradley and other people to examine other assemblages and artifacts from Texas and North America and beyond. But that's what I do here, and I'm an experimental archaeologist, so that intimacy of working with stone and not only analyzing the technologies that I'm looking at, but kind of decipher the behaviorals or develop some framework of what I think is going on in the technologies, and then experimentally produce them and do multiple batteries of experiments to get to where my debitage, my flake debris, and the final products of the tools look like the archaeological record or what we are excavating out of the ground. And so I'm trying to get as close as possible to the behaviors of our prehistoric counterparts, the hunter-gatherer, artisans or tool makers and so on. And that's what I do here as an analyst, looking at the Gault assemblage, which is enormous.
And what are you going to talk to us about today?
Well, today I'm going to focus on a small special group of artifacts from the Gault site, which relates to the older than Clovis component, which was in a deep buried context below the Clovis horizon from Area 15 of the Gault site. So just a little brief synopsis of some of my interpretations of those artifacts is what I'll talk about today.
Great, I'm excited. So let's get started.
All right. Well, basically, I have lined out that I'm coming at it from an experimentalist standpoint. So I spend a lot of time replicating the artifacts, and this is important as I go through this. So I do not spend a lot of time describing artifacts by their metrics and so much by the morphologies, but the behaviors that made the products, whether it's debris or the final product. So I'm going to go into that. So this is based on a bit more of a technical talk, but I'm going to keep it into railroad language and keep it simple. And let's get started. So just quickly, again, I always like to frame things with terminology and getting a good conceptual framework for things. When I say technology and when I talk technology, I'm not just talking about the final product like a dart point or an arrow point, but the whole sequence of behaviors that goes into making those things. So how hunter-gatherers are quarrying material or selecting materials from the landscape, whether it's high investment, low investment, high quality, low quality, and so on, and all the production behaviors that take it to the final form. All of that is technology to me. And that's every part of looking at that and analyzing that is what technological analysis is. So that's important to keep in mind as I get into some of the interpretations. So when I look at tools, my knee-jerk reaction is, okay, what are the abstract knowledge forms that people have to have? What is the design that they're going for and strategy? Then what kind of toolkits are involved, and how are they sort of strategizing and thinking three-dimensional and problem solving and kind of using toolkits to shape the tools that they're making, and also the kind of scars that they're creating, which have patterns. So I bring it all together in this intimate way to get an interpretation of what's going on, artifact by artifact, and then distilling out the broad patterns in a whole population of artifacts, and kind of see if I can discriminate some patterns that might give us some insights about a single group that might be involved, or multiple groups that have different systems of thinking and different toolkits and so on and so forth. So my whole methodology just kind of goes into a lot of behavioral analysis. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about that, but it's basically like, you know, I kind of go through 30, 35, 36 behavioral tasks that I'm basically checking off yes and no in my analysis, and it's quite a tedious job, but I love it. But it's behaviorally based, and that's what I really want people to know. So in sum, the assemblage of all the artifacts below Clovis at the Gault site is actually enormous. There's hundreds of pieces and so on. But today I'm just going to be talking about bifaces, the bifacial technology, those tools that are through percussion and pressure flaking and different kinds of chipping of stone, where it's happening on both sides and creating a bifacial plane for the most part. You know, I'm just going to be talking about those. So dart points, knives, scrapers, possibly some perforators, and these kinds of tools, and kind of describe what's going on in this assemblage, because it is quite interesting, and it's very important for us to know what behaviors are going on so we can compare it to the younger Clovis assemblage, and ask those important questions. Are there relationships to Clovis? Are they completely distinct and different? Is it one group of hunter-gatherers, or are there multiple groups of hunter-gatherers there prior to older than Clovis? Very significant questions. And so my analysis, I think, really helps paint a part of the picture of what's going on. And so what I want to start off with real quick is just kind of stating right off the bat, you know, that we do have some complex bifacial technologies going on down there below Clovis. And what I mean by complex is that you need complex knowledge and you need complex skill. So somebody that's spending the hundreds, thousands of hours to develop that skill to be able to remotely be able to complete these sophisticated forms. So we do have some of that stuff. Some of those things are small bifacial points, such as the one I have on the screen right now. But we also have some of the more, I would say, what one might expect in these upper Paleolithic or Paleo-Indian intervals in North America, where you have the lanceolate types of forms that are a little larger, something similar to Clovis or maybe St. Mary's Hall or something like that. So, but to just start off real quick, what was really unexpected for us was to find bifacial specialized technologies that are really, really small, you know, really significantly small bifaces that really represent, or we just don't have anything similar to that in North America. And this was quite a surprise, and probably to summarize a lot of the analysis I had on these small bifaces, these hafted points, is that, well, they're certainly not following a same design form, but they are following a very, very similar morphological format. So the hafting features, what they're hafted onto, is basically like the same size. Think of the shaft or foreshaft and so on that it's hafted to. It's basically really the same size, but you have different morphologies. So do you have different groups? Possibly, or maybe the design is not as important as just the more utilitarian need to meet a certain hafting format. So this is pretty interesting, and some of these indicate some really complex flaking skill and knowledge. Um, and also some of these pieces seem to be so similar in the way they're flaked with their flaking patterns that there seems to be a lot of overlap. So I'm leaning more towards, with some of these smaller pieces, that you have a common knowledge, a common technological approach or rule system that is, rather than imposing some design on it, it's more so meeting a certain a morphological format, a little bit more utilitarian. So that was quite interesting, and pretty soon we'll be publishing some of this, some of the findings. It will be in the Gault monograph, what I'm talking about here, and I'm kind of going through some slides here that are sort of describing some of the flaking patterns and some of my analysis, and really kind of looking at how they're applying their force loads, and just demonstrating what types of flakes are being removed, the patterns that they're going in, and this gives me an idea of the toolkits, the kind of toolkit implements they're using, whether it's like some sort of tine or some sort of pressure flaker, or maybe an indirect percussion or stone percussion. All of these flake scars and their patterns give me some insight into that. So I'm just going through some of these images of the smaller forms. You can see the scale in centimeters. And I did quite a lot of experimental points following this format, following this technological direction, and creating similar flaking patterns, and kind of checking out in a hands-on way some of the principles behind making these things. And yeah, it's yielded some really interesting insights, I would say. Actually, maybe I'll go back. The one here on the right is an experimental one, kind of using the format of the archaeological specimens on the left. And yeah, that's just an example. And I used indirect percussion in this specimen to replicate the flake length, the flake width, and that we see in the archaeological specimen, and so on. And here are some of the lanceolate base fragments that come out from below the Clovis assemblage. So deep down in this zone that's dated to between 16 and 20,000 years ago, these small specimens and these lanceolate base fragments are there. So these are quite old. And what jumps out, I think, what jumped out to me immediately was that both the strategies and the flaking patterns are completely different. They're not the same technology at all. And so I go through a process of essentially making a lot of bifaces in different ways to kind of replicate certain kinds of flaking patterns in the bases, and kind of arrive at what I feel is going on the level of the artisans of these lanceolate forms in this really old context. So basically, in the lanceolate fragments, I see two different technological groups clearly. They have very different ways of thinning the bifaces. If you were to put the bifaces in cross section, the way they control and what they're going for in shape and morphology and so on is different. The one on the left here, you can see I've mapped out some of the flake scars. I mean, you're doing a lot of longitudinal, well-controlled thinning flakes, whereas the one on the right, the cross section is very flat, and the patterns of flaking are very different. And even the flakes themselves have slightly different morphologies and so on, because the type of percussion and pressure is different. So different technologies down there. That's quite fascinating. But then we can kind of get into some other tool types, like these larger pieces or thicker, more crude looking pieces that do have some specialized flaking on them. But yeah, you could say that there's quite a large group of bifacial tools in this older than Clovis component that kind of represent a lot of, you could say, general processing tools. So you have choppers and scrapers and so on. And here, this core chopper actually is very intriguing because it demonstrates a really well executed overshot flake. And so, that alone might, cause some ears and ears to go up and eyes to widen, and maybe we're dealing with a Clovis technology here. And well, I guess the clear answer to that is that, well, it was clearly a strategic overshot. It's well controlled and so on. But overall, in the context of the assemblage, there's just not enough to say if we have some sort of unexpected Clovis technology that's made its way into this deeper layer. There's no indication depositionally of that happening. And there's just one overshot flake. So that's not much data to go by to call this Clovis in any way, but it is a very, very interesting execution of a strategy there to remove thickness in the middle of this ovate form. And I did a lot of experiments. Here's an example of one of my experimental ones. The light colored one is right next to the actual artifact. So I made a similar a chopper scraper, and I executed an overshot in a similar fashion, and to kind of arrive at what's going on in the platform creation, what it takes to make this exactly. And yeah, so I think I've kind of got really, really close to the real thing. And I've done that with the whole assemblage, but let me move on here. So there's also a lot of medium-sized bifaces and biface fragments that are in the assemblage and somewhat abundance. And really what we're dealing with is some very, very quick creation of some heavy knives and cutting tools. So really heavy-handed work, a real quick creation of sharp edges, but nothing that takes it to that advanced level where you're doing advanced thinning, real clear flaking pattern that requires a lot more strategy early on in the reduction process. This is a little bit more basic tool creation where you simply need only a few basic principles learned, and you can quickly make these things within a few minutes. It's not too difficult. And we have quite a lot of these down there below the Clovis zone. So in this older than Clovis component, we do have quite a few of these. And we have some distal tips that are down there also. Some of them have a little mixture of some really well-controlled flaking alongside not so good flaking. So maybe a piece changes hands. Maybe there's some teaching involved. There's all kinds of things behaviorally we have to consider as analysts. So, for the medium-sized bifaces, I basically can break them down into two groups. I mean, basically they begin in the very similar processes, and they have very common, you could say, principles being applied. So their distinction is hardly none, except some of them have the inclusion of some specialized skills being involved. And I'm going to be writing. Well, I've already written about it, but this discussion will be in the monograph that will be coming out. So getting back really quickly to the complex technology and the Gault assemblage, here's a really good sort of image of that. You have the small forms on the left. You have a couple of the lanceolate bases in the middle. You have some advanced techniques here on the right. The bottom right showing a really, really well flaked kind of perforating knife, kind of a flat-backed knife that was really well executed. And I would say when in looking at the specimen really closely, there is some even color alteration in there, which I think we need to start considering heat treatment or thermal alteration going on in some of these older tools. Which is not so commonly considered. And I think we need to consider that alongside some other skill sets in these very, very early assemblages, including like indirect percussion techniques. Here's some more imagery of the more basic utilitarian kind of flaking. There we go. And so I'm not going to go into this slide in any kind of detailed way, but basically what I like to get across to people, two big broad patterns that you generally can like distill out from the landscape in terms of lithic technologies. And one is all of the expedient toolcraft, the quick creation of sharp edges and puncturing kind of devices that people have always needed. So it's really a quick expedient craft. You don't really need a whole lot of advanced knowledge or skill to produce them. And then you have the complex stuff that requires, you could say, a teacher and student situation, most likely. Someone introducing you to these complex forms of knowledge and skill and practice and how to practice and so on. And so each of those, one can tunnel down further into, but it's good to keep those two in mind when looking at assemblages, when looking at flake debris, debitage, and so on. But to kind of wrap up, how does an experimentalist like me look at the 40 or 50 or so bifaces that we have in the older than Clovis component? And I'd like to go through these 5 main points here. And the number one is like roughly half of the biface assemblage are expedient tools related to the quick production of sharp edges. And the other half is basically about the creation of points and knives that are related to specialized production systems. Again, that specialized knowledge, specialized skill, which requires specialized toolkits, so on and so forth. And number 2 is the complex and specialized technologies in the assemblage. They don't relate to one single coherent industry, but they seem to be a smattering of different technological groups, which could be related to different hunter-gatherers at different times, or just different people coming through and having some time there at the Gault locality some 16 to 20,000 years ago. And then number 3, the stemmed points appear to focus upon morphological requirements instead of imposing a specific emblematic designs, which I said at the very, very beginning. Those small little bifaces, they really have a common morphological format and some flaking pattern similarities, but the actual design and shape are different.
So with later assemblages, do you see that uniqueness from technological groups, or is there more similarity between technological groups and later assemblages?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. If I were to like isolate my answer to what we see from Area 15 at the Gault site, when you get a little bit later into the Clovis component, there's such a, I would say, a stringent system of how to reduce stone that is so pervading. It's like there is this knowledge package that is so apparent across the debitage and the final forms. And that older than Clovis stuff, it's not like that. You have these different packages, and so you have different kinds of debitage that relate to different toolkits and ways of working the toolkits, and you have it's less coherent and so on. And then if I were to go further into, like, say, archaic time periods where we get into, I guess I could just pick something like when we get into the Calf Creek Horizon, there's just, there's a lot of evidence there of a specific rule system of making bifaces, but at the same time, some things are difficult to answer your question perfectly because, depositional processes are not so perfect to tell me that something from, say, early triangular or something that is so close to the Calf Creek Horizon might be creeping in there in terms of debitage and so on. So I'm hoping I'm getting to your answer here, but what I would say generally is that the rule systems at these later times seem to be more coherent and clear. Like Cap Creek Horizon, they have their behavioral pattern. You know, Bull Verity, they have their behavioral pattern. You know, Castroville, Montel, they have these clear systems of reduction that are just kind of coherent when you go through these different temporal periods and so on. And in my own experience of looking at other sites and so on, I see the same thing. If I hit a Castroville Montel component, it's amazing how universal the knowledge packet is. It's like they have a specific way of doing things. And in this older than Clovis material, it is not this way. There's a smattering of different rule systems, and that's interesting to me.